Today's presentation is applying a threat-informed defence and achieving business resiliency. My name is Wadhwa-Brown. I sit in Cisco's professional services in the Centre of Excellence. Yuri, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Yuri Kramarz. I work for Cisco Talos Incident Response as principal engineer.
Okay, so our first question, just to kind of set the scene, it'd be interesting to see how many of you are using threat modelling today. Is it a topic of conversation? Is it something you're experienced with? Is it something that you know nothing about? Just to kind of set the base expectations in terms of how mature or otherwise participants are. Okay, so I can see a few of you voting. We'll leave that running over the course of the session, so you'll have an opportunity to put that in when perhaps you put the dots together and worked out what we're talking about. But let's step into what we're actually going to talk about. So the case for threat-informed defence, why Cisco thinks threat-informed defence is an important aspect to achieving business resiliency. A view on the threat landscape. We're going to hear first from Yuri about what the incident response view of the threat landscape looks like, and then we're going to have a little bit of a look at what we've been doing as Cisco with MITRE around the MITRE attack framework. Then we're going to move into the threat modelling in a more active fashion. We're going to talk about how Cisco priorities business functions, what we mean by secure design, and again, wrapping it up, how that plays into that response and detection capability that most organisations have. What do you need to make sure that you're secure, that the business functions that you rely upon, the revenue generating, etc., that they're not being interfered with, manipulated or otherwise by adversaries inside or outside your organisation. So, Yuri and I are both from, I suppose, originally an offensive mindset. Yuri, I'm sure will tell you far more in a second about him, but my background is I started off life building SOCs for banking, specifically working for one of the UK banks. I moved into a round of about 15 years of doing offensive security, predominantly critical national infrastructure here in the UK, before moving into Cisco and essentially acting, I suppose, as a joiner of functions. I sit there and I try and help organisations get their blue and their red teams working effectively together. I try and help engineering teams understand what security organisation requires, and I try and help the security organisation explain to the business why things are the way they are. Yeah, these days you can't really think about operations and engineering without thinking about security, but it's not always the case that the security part of the business and the engineering part of the business are particularly comfortable with each other. There's often different language, different requirements, different reasons to exist, and that often can cause conflicts. Yuri, do you want to just explain your background so we've got everyone on the same page?
Yeah, sure. So I've started working in a little company called Talos Security many years back, and that's where we met Tim. So also started in offensive security, moved to the defensive security. So in my career as offensive security, I was doing penetration testing, red teaming, looking at the OT operations, security of SCADA systems, also working on some of the CNI aspects in UK and abroad. And then decided to switch the sides from the red teaming and offensive into defensive. So using all of my knowledge that I've gathered over the years and help our customers defend themselves. So I do this through the incident response and some of the practice pieces of work that I execute with our customers.
So when Cisco talks about resiliency, we're really talking about two things. The ability to adapt to change, and change can come from regulatory pressures, it can come from changes in the threat landscape, but also being able to cope with disruption and unplanned changes. It's one thing to know that you've got something you need to do in 12 months' time because the regulator has made a change to the laws or the rules that govern your industry, but quite another perhaps to think about, well, actually, how do you adapt to something that happens quite quickly? COVID might be quite a good example of that. We often have challenges as organisations dealing with the fact that we all used to come into the office and now we don't all come into the office. So, you know, making sure that that resiliency exists, not just in terms of the stuff that we're expected to change, but also the stuff that we're not expecting to change. And specifically, how does that play to things like your critical assets, things that keep your lights on, that keep your customers making payments and allow you to remunerate your staff? Perfect example, you think about an organization that is very office centric, and at the beginning of COVID, they needed to allow their employees to work from anywhere. They said, well, we're going to put collaboration platforms in place. We're going to connect our internal phone system to the internet. One of the use cases that we'll talk about in a bit more detail later on is, well, actually, you're going to plug your collaboration platform into the internet. Well, what does that mean in terms of the resiliency of that environment? Now you've got an entirely different set of threat actors, an entirely different attack surface, etc. So off the back of that, you really need to think about how that informs your defense. What do you need to protect as you move from having everything on an internal network to having things on the internet? And to make sure that your understanding of the threat landscape informs how you make those changes so that you don't make changes that actually put you at greater risk off the back of what seemed like a sensible business decision. Yuri, do you want to kind of chip in and give your take from the incident response perspective? Because I guess you've probably got slightly different experiences of resiliency.
Yeah, so our resilience is the way we kind of look at this from the IR perspective is we look at the capabilities to either detect the threat kind of early on before it becomes a serious problem, or looking to contain the threat that you were able to detect early on. So, you know, resiliency from the kind of, there might be a threat in the environment and there might be a way for us to quickly defend, quickly identify it. This is what we will typically look for from the IR perspective. So in the IR world, really our job, and you know, for most of our customers also, of course, is to be able to detect, respond, contain, and perform all of those kind of eradication recovery options that they need to perform in order to carry on with the business, right? So some of those decisions that are being made, like you mentioned, for example, you know, plugging in the phone into the internet, right? It's an excellent business decision. You are able to scale up, get all of your employees into the office, but that also means that you're increasing your attack surface, exposing potential system that might not necessarily be by itself as resilient to cybersecurity attacks as it would be otherwise. And so suddenly there's this environment landing in the internet, and you know, that might be a target for the adversaries out there looking to compromise that environment, looking to use that as a leeway into the organization, and then typically trying to do things like, for example, ransomware, because that's where a lot of the money will come from.
Okay, so we're trying to minimize the surprise in the cyber domain, Yuri. What should we be thinking about?
So a couple of things, and I like to talk about this, the threat landscape. So the landscape constantly changes, right? It's a very complex environment. You know, lots of folks out there are running things like, for example, hybrid clouds, where you might have a cloud environment, well, in the cloud infrastructure, you might have SaaS and PaaS, and also some sort of hybrid connectivity to your internal environment. You might be syncing your data out to the cloud. And you know, trying to get a hold of that, making sure that you actually understand, you know, maybe you have some resiliency in, let's say, multiple cloud deployments. You have Google Cloud as well as Azure, as well as AWS for redundancy backups. And you really need to start monitoring all of those pieces to make sure you actually understand what are the potential impact points in your environment. So when we talk about threat landscape, really what we talk about is a fairly complex environment that any business can run, starting from very small businesses to large enterprise environments. We're talking about threat actors, for example, targeting a particular vertical, like for example, in Q1 FY23, healthcare sector was the most targeted vertical that we dealt with from the incident response perspective. And that what this means is that the adversaries are effectively moving from one vertical to another. The fact that, for example, a company or vertical that you work with might not have been targeted up to this point doesn't mean it won't be targeted in the future, right? And so you've got constantly changing landscape. You've got with the verticals and the adversaries looking to take advantage of weaknesses in a particular vertical, because, for example, there might be vulnerabilities coming out to do with a particular piece of software used by a lot of organizations within that space, like, for example, medical software, you know, hospital management. New vulnerability comes out. Of course, we're gonna see healthcare sector being targeted out, because that's where the adversaries know that those pieces of software are, and they're easy to compromise. So yeah, threat landscape, isn't necessary just with adversaries, of course. It's also down to your own environments, right? It's also down to how are you deploying some of your technologies in place. Like I mentioned, for example, hybrid cloud, where some pieces of the cloud are very well monitored. Some pieces of the cloud might not be monitored at all because they're infrastructure as a service. And of course, the providers will tell you that you need to do your own job and monitor the environment. And some of them will be monitored by your providers, right? If you have some sort of SaaS or PaaS solution, you might as well have in contract that they'll be looking to identify whether there's any attacks happening within that environment and notify you about that. The other aspects, of course, are supply chains, right? So threat landscape isn't necessarily just about the environment that you run yourself. It's also about your supply chains. We've seen an example of this with, for example, SolarWinds a couple of years back, where SolarWinds being deployed to monitor the infrastructure in quite a key junctions of various networks and environments. And then, of course, SolarWinds being compromised and then pushing down the update to systems, which meant that effectively wherever SolarWinds was, you could have a adversary activity that wasn't necessarily easy to detect as well, because I believe it was attributed to a potential government-based entity. Now, of course, network systems and environmental complexity grows, right? So over time, that makes sense. Every business out there is looking to grow. They're looking to deploy new technology, retire old technologies. Sometimes that retirement process isn't necessarily the best, as in like there might be a lot of systems still in the environment, whether it's cloud or on-prem, that are simply left there because somebody moved on. They didn't really plan for decommissioning, and that really creates an attack surface that can be taken advantage of by adversaries, for example, to deploy some tools or deploy and make them those kind of systems as a center of their activity within the environment. Because a lot of the kind of threat landscape monitoring and also identification of the threat relies on being able to monitor the environment. So if you're able to hide yourself in some system that is about to be decommissioned but doesn't have the same security monitoring as all the other ones, then it's a great vantage point to go from there and try to attack all kinds of different environments, and it might be very difficult then to track what is actually happening. There's also, of course, the human aspects of this, right? So threat landscape as a kind of alert fatigue. So the more systems we deploy, the more monitoring we deploy in environments, the more people we need to hire to monitor those environments, and the more alerts typically those systems will generate. A well-configured system wouldn't necessarily have a large number of alerts. They would simply have a specific alert really designed for that system or designed for a particular process that needs to be monitored. And that's where that kind of threat modeling aspect comes out as well, is effectively we're trying to also reduce the amount of alerts and reduce the amount of logs that might not necessarily be picked up, or they don't necessarily need to be part of the SOC analysis aspect, because what they do is add complexity where they actually, what we're trying to defend isn't really relying on any of those logs. So that is also one of the challenging aspects of threat landscape, right? We monitor environments, but we might end up with way too much data. And the final piece, and it's really important for the kind of ICS space or SCADA and OT environments, is the digitization of the analog assets. So historically speaking, lots of OT environments would be kind of relying on manual processes, analog devices, for example, serial connectivity into the environment. You might have physical devices somewhere in the network, and they'll be using serial connection to communicate with some sort of controller that would then tell you about, let's say, pressure or something else. Nowadays, what tends to happen is that those assets will then effectively move from being analog into being digital, which means that somewhere down there's going to be a device that translates the traffic into, let's say, a network-based traffic, and then that is being sent across the environment, and then eventually that makes it all the way to, let's say, some sort of core database that stores the like reading from the gauges, or maybe potentially even things like reading of the pressures or somewhere else, and alerts you through like even an email about the fact that there's something wrong. So really important for the kind of OT aspect. But it does introduce and does increase the threat landscape, right? Because suddenly you have more devices and you have more and more systems and more environment pieces that you need to defend. And the actual that digitization aspect might not necessarily be well understood. Where, for example, you have to be migrating from analog to digital or to network-based, Ethernet-based, and then suddenly you have something else that you also need to defend and make sure that those devices are not abused if the adversary gets into that piece of an environment. So that's more or less the threat landscape as we see it right now. But of course, really, it's changing, right? So we can talk about the point in time, what we see out there, the growing complexity and hybrid cloud, but we don't necessarily always see everything, and of course that will change.
So yeah, as Yuri alluded to, the purpose of threat modeling from Cisco's perspective is to try and help customers tackle some of those challenges, to get a better understanding about what the business critical systems look like, to have a better cognizance to what kinds of alerts are necessary inside them, and to ultimately help security organizations fine-tune and focus their efforts on the places that matter most from the perspective of keeping the lights on, keeping your customer service up and running, and ensuring that your staff can be paid at the end of each month, the end of each week, etc. So inside of that, one of the things that I've spent quite a lot of time doing is working with MITRE. So some of you may be familiar with MITRE, but MITRE is essentially a non-governmental organisation based out of the US that looks at hard problems in the cybersecurity space, actually the wider space just in cybersecurity, but cybersecurity in general, and it looks at kind of the challenges that we have as a community, and it tries to break those down into bite-sized pieces that we can kind of start to tackle, we can start to look at and break off and solve bits of the problem. So the threat-informed defense stuff is something that they've been particularly keen on, but it's something that obviously Cisco has seen, liked, and has adopted, and we now contribute into. So to put context behind why we're using MITRE, it's something that Cisco still sees real value in, not just from the perspective of myself, from a security research perspective, not just from the perspective of Talos and incident response, but right across Cisco, right down into the routers and switches. And you'll find that Cisco is contributing to networking and Linux in particular, but you'll find us popping up in other places too, sharing that threat intelligence, helping strengthen the community. I think there's a real belief inside MITRE, and it's something that the cybersecurity community has kind of taken to heart, that a rising tide lifts all ships, and we can't just secure ourselves as individuals. We have to secure the internet. We have to secure our communities also. Why does Cisco think this is relevant? Why does Cisco think it's beneficial to our customers? Shared language is incredibly important. I talked about some of the challenges about the difference between an engineer's view of an organization and a security team's view of the organization. MITRE ATT&CK gives that shared language, and so when we do threat modeling with our customers, it's something that they benefit from quite substantially, in the sense that it starts to allow, for example, the operations team inside a telecoms provider to talk to the security team, or starts to allow a security team to start to explain their concerns to, for example, the team that's responsible for PLCs in manufacturing or in energy. And it starts to give us a structure by which we can measure capability and capacity. We can start to talk about things like the question of detection versus visibility. Yuri talked about the fact that there's alert fatigue, but actually the fidelity of alerts is utmost in people's mind from the perspective of protecting their businesses. It's not simply the case that you've got logs and they're sitting in a seam somewhere and they're there if the worst should happen, but actually we should be actively monitoring that. And threat-informed defense allows us to look at where we should actively monitor and why we should actively monitor. So if you take nothing else away from today's presentation, from today's session, go and have a look at what MITRE are doing. I think it's something that, if you're not cognizant of it, it's definitely something you should be starting to build into how you approach security, not just from the perspective of the regulations and the checkboxes that we all have to jump through because of the environments we work in and the regulators we work with, but also actually simply the fact that actually some of security should be driven from that threat landscape. We should be making sure that we do, as security professionals, ties into efficacy when dealing with detecting the threats that are out there in the world. The example I always give, the concept of password strength is fantastic, but you'll find lots of documents that tell you it should be a particular length, it should have this number of characters, that number of characters. Well, actually, look at the threat landscape. The threat landscape has kind of moved on, and adversaries are even at the point where they're able to breach systems that have used multi-factor authentication, and keeping on top of what threat actors are doing and how they're behaving through something like MITRE ATT&CK gives you the best chance of understanding how to detect, protect, respond, recover, etc. So my next question for those on this call: what is the threat model for a network device? Obviously, Cisco is known for routers and switches. Where would you say, you presumably all got some level of networking within your organizations, where would you say you focus your efforts in terms of protecting the underlying network that your business runs on? Anyone hazard a guess? Okay, so we've got a couple of suggestions: vulnerable assets and NDR, XDR, yeah. EDR, all of the DRs. I think it changes every week which ones we're using, but yeah, NetFlow is a good idea. How do you understand how your devices are interacting? NetFlow gives you that visibility in a relatively easy to consume fashion. This topic is quite dear to my heart because I do a lot of work with service providers, and you can imagine service providers, if no one else, has a lot of routers and switches. So when I think about the network device threat model, what I'm really thinking about is this. You'll notice it comes from MITRE. It's something that Cisco contributed quite heavily when it was put together, but essentially it's a view of how an adversary moves through a network at the network level. So layer 2, layer 3, op, routing, switching, DNS, all of those services that underpin the way a business functions. Look at it from this perspective. They come in over the internet in some fashion, they exploit some systems, they gain some level of access, they leverage that access to gain some level of persistence. Oftentimes they'll look to impact the telemetry that device is collecting. Think about the service provider, the operations team will care about the router or the switch from an availability perspective, if nothing else, but an adversary will often seek to inhibit that visibility. When they've got access, maybe they'll use it for something like capture of network traffic or access to configuration systems that the network device has access to. But ultimately, probably what they'll be trying to do, if they're targeting the network in particular, they'll be looking at exfiltration. They'll be looking at how they can get some of that data they've captured at network level out. And you see that in the real world. Yeah, if you look at things like the VPN filter or some of the more recent adversarial reports from similar types of groups, there's a real interest in network devices because they give access to the network. But it's a great example where threat modeling can be quite helpful, because often that's not necessarily something an organization focuses on. An organization may sit there and go, well, actually, the value of our systems is the business data that we hold in Oracle or in DB2 or whatever. But it's just a real reminder that actually not everything starts with getting access to DB2 or Oracle or WebEx or any of those business products. Oftentimes there's a number of stages that get you there in advance, and it's those pieces that threat-informed defense is there to try and help us tackle. We don't want to be dealing with impact and dealing with ransomware, and I'm sure Yuri would much prefer not to be getting out of bed to deal with yet another ransomware outbreak. If we can help customers get to the point where they're detecting faster, where they're spotting aspects of initial access or aspects of persistence, or people sniffing around inside the networks, then actually we'll probably end up with a more resilient view about how we treat adversaries who are after our crown jewels. But actually, take a step back, networks is just a function that allows the business to operate, but it's not really the value of a business. So when we talk about threat modeling, What we're really looking at is the things that enable the business to function. And that means ultimately the impact needs to think about fines from data loss or service outage affecting revenue or loss due to fraud. We put those into kind of buckets of confidentiality, integrity, availability, etc. But ultimately, each of these things is going to vary markedly depending on what business you are. We might be lucky and be able to say, well, everyone has a network. But in a practical sense, when I do threat modeling, what I'm really looking at is what makes your business your business. Yeah. Is it a bank that has a treasury function or has a payment platform? Is it a service provider that is offering mobile connectivity, handsets, and people making, receiving phone calls, sending text messages, etc.? Or is it, as is the case at the moment, a manufacturing organisation that's producing the things that we consume, food? They're producing bread, they're producing tins of fruit, they're producing the stuff that goes into our sandwiches that we eat each day. And so when I talk about threat modeling, whilst I talk about from quite a technical perspective, most of what we do when we deliver threat modeling to customers is about understanding about what matters to the business. Is it the fines? Is it the service outage? Is it loss due to fraud, or is it something else? And so when you go away and you go back to your business, what you really need to start to think about is, okay, so what business functions do we rely upon? And how do those business functions work? And is the router and switch the most important thing? Well, it might be for a service provider, but it may not be for you. Realistically, what are you trying to protect? Accept that we can't necessarily protect everything. In some regards, maybe we can. We can all sit there and say, well, we can protect all of the Windows devices that we use to connect to our networks. We can all protect the email that we're using to communicate with our peers. But when you start to get to those business critical systems, the pieces that keep the lights on, that keep your business up and running, that generate your revenue, that allow you to pay your staff, etc., that's going to vary markedly. And whether you're interested in confidentiality and data theft, or whether you're interested in integrity and fraud, or whether you're interested in availability of ransomware, it's going to depend on what services you want. So when we do this with customers, what we're really trying to do is get you to talk about your business, what matters to the business. How would your business cope with the theft of the data from a system of record in a bank, if you're a bank? How would the business deal with ransomware hitting your manufacturing lines of production? And how would your business deal with perhaps somebody making fraudulent purchases? And then conversely, on the server side, exactly the same again. Which aspects of confidentiality, which databases of the maybe hundreds of databases you have as an organization, which ones really contain data that will put you at risk in terms of things like regulatory pressures or in terms of things like fraud? Which systems, if they got tampered with, would put you at biggest risk? Is there a system that essentially controls the ingredients that go into the food that you sell in your supermarket? Is there a particular aspect to the way that you do business that means that availability becomes a concern? Talk about, for example, a transport hub. If a transport hub can't get its passengers in and out of that transport hub, then that has a real systemic impact on that organisation's business to generate revenue, to pay staff, to keep the lights on. So our approach to threat modelling is looking at what we've seen in the real world, how that ties into who you are, and who, how, why an adversary might target you. There's lots of threat intelligence out there. A lot of threat intelligence tends to be quite outwards in centric, in the sense that it talks about this group of actors did this, this group of actors did that. One of the things that I think makes what we're doing slightly different from that is we take an inside out view, in the sense that we look at, well, okay, so you are a bank, you are an airport, you are a pharmaceutical company. What does MitraTac tell us about how that kind of vertical has been attacked in the past? What systems impacted previous victims. How did the attackers impact those previous victims? And therefore, what should we be looking to protect from the perspective of prioritization? We look at the critical assets. We look at the techniques that impact those critical assets. And so, perfect example, you can't go to MicroAttack and read up on how the mainframe that's used to hold all of your money is stored. But what Cisco can do is help you translate MicroAttack from the generic threats that affect every business, the Linux, the Windows, etc., into the core technologies that you worry about that keep your lights on. Map all of your assets and techniques into a graph, and then start to look at where the critical components are. When you start to look at that, you start to realize that not everything is equally important. The greatest example I can give, most organizations have some degree of separation between the enterprise and the business technology, whether that's the network in a service provider, whether that's the factory in a manufacturing organization, treasury systems inside a bank, etc. The kill chain that we put together essentially allows us to start to understand where those dependencies exist and what's necessary to secure those points first. Not just from the perspective of the generic, we should have some logging, but the specific too. Is there a specific way that a message bus might be manipulated versus, for example, how a database might be manipulated? Absolutely. And when you secure your organization, that cognizance should be at forefront of mind. No point in simply saying, well, we've secured the operating system, we don't need to worry about the applications that run on it. The number of breaches I've seen where actually it's the application that's become the focal point because it's the data in the application that matters, not the privilege on the operating system. Having cognizance of that and understanding how that translates into your business's functions, into the services that support those functions, etc. That's what we're here to do. So yeah, this kind of puts it, I think, in quite nice context. John, like TWC, is a fairly famous threat intelligence researcher from Microsoft, and that point is never more true. We all get reports when we're looking after systems that have red, amber, green in them. The things that are most problematic, the things that are slightly less problematic, and the things that are least problematic. If we just think in terms of lists, we'll all have our own lists and we won't ever cross compare, and we won't look at where dependencies exist. We won't think about how the compromise of Bob's system over there affects Francis's system over there. Threat modeling for me and threat informed defense is about understanding how systems intertwine and how the compromise of two ostensibly unrelated systems can come to pass, and how the compromise of one leads to the compromise of the other, and then potentially the compromise of the first leads to the exfiltration of data from the second. Not necessarily the case that it would be the same people that manage those systems, might not even be the same organizations, might not even be the same businesses. Certainly when you start to think about software as a service, infrastructure as service, etc., not necessarily the case that you're always sharing a responsibility with just one other organization anymore. So this is where I fit in terms of threat modeling, helping customers build more securely. If you've got questions around where do we need to place our security controls to maximize our resilience, if you've got questions around what risks do we need to think about when we build a new technology, a new application stack, or if you're looking to figure out, well, actually, where should we test our resiliency and why, that's kind of where you would come to me and hopefully to Cisco and say, well, actually, we've got problems in this space, can you help? And our answer would, of course, be yes, absolutely. Because from my perspective, threat modeling gives me the tools to help me qualify and quantify those problems. And I think when I talk to certainly some of our peers, when I talk to some of the customers we're already working with, you can kind of see that life cycle happening. I've got a customer that's a service provider that runs a huge network spread across the globe. They're 4 years into talking to us, and we've gone from the theoretical concept of a threat model right through to implementation of targeted security controls based on the business domains they're operating in, the services that they're generating revenue from, building out detection capability that aligns specifically to that. Doing another piece of work for a manufacturer where they're at the start of that process and they're really just starting to say, well, actually, which bits of our system do we care about from a security perspective? Secure by design should mean that we capture all of that at that first point rather than at that last point. But of course, organizations being as they are, no organization is entirely greenfield. And if you have brownfield situations where you think we can help, then happy to have those conversations also. So come on, Yuri, how do we protect our critical assets?
Cool, thank you very much, Tim. So, so how do we actually protect, right? So the question here always is about, do we even understand some of our assets, right? And it's not just about the assets as in physical service, or you actual, let's say, data, but it's also about the processes that those assets will typically work with. You know, payroll process is an example of that, right? Payroll process, right, relies on the data that is stored somewhere, hopefully not a spreadsheet or SharePoint, but should be some sort of database, maybe even encrypted. And at some point, let's say at the end of the month, there's a trigger that will basically release the money from the bank into individual employee accounts based on the details of those accounts being saved in the environment, as well as the actual amount of money that they will be paid. Now, that's a very simple system, right? But you have a couple of things to protect. One thing here is, of course, to understand what assets we need to protect, and that is the database or the spreadsheet, depending how we run the payroll, with a specific PII data, like your employee account numbers, your employee names, addresses, anything else that needs to be put in as part of the payroll. And of course, the other aspect is the process itself. At some point, this process will trigger, and we need to run. If your employees don't get paid for a month because there's a problem with the payment process, then that means that you need to look into really, okay, how can we go about protecting that process? Because that is something that we need to understand as a business. So simple example, but very relevant to today's conversation, right? Is understanding the assets, understanding the processes that you're trying to defend, and actually focusing your defense mechanism on that is a good first step to work out what are you actually need to, how you actually going to go about defending your environment, and what are some of the key modeling variables that you need to take in place to understand what are the potential attack surfaces that you're also trying to review. Now you could do this by, say, drawing dependency trees, mapping data flows, looking at some of those processes and sitting down with the kind of cross-business architecture teams. So just an example, we might want to sit down with HR because that could be one of our key processes that we are trying to protect. And then understanding how the data flows, what are the assets involved in the process, is something that will help you to map up what are some of the key critical components that we're trying to defend. Now, typically, you would then, of course, build a plan around that. So if you are defending the environment, you are making sure that you're trying to reduce the attack surface on critical assets, then you need to have a plan of how we're going to do this, right? And it might be as simple as saying, look, wherever there's a critical asset, we need to have multi-factor authentication deployed, or maybe we need to perform video understanding of the process flow to actually start putting components together that we need to defend. Or perform that threat modeling exercise. Maybe we also need to work out how would we actually go about defending that specific process, and how do we build resilience in that process to make sure that it can run irrespective of everything. The reality of the business is that, a simple example, payroll needs to run no matter whether you run somewhere or not, right? Your employees will have mortgages they need to pay, they will have bills that they need to pay, and despite everything, somehow, whether it's a manual processing or automated processing, the process needs to run, right? And that is also quite relevant for a large number of industries and large number of businesses out there that are running some of the key critical national infrastructure pieces, that no matter what happens, there needs to be water in the tap. Now, the way you can go about that, of course, is building a nice kind of trees and process list that you're trying to protect, and then looking at the that you map into Mike. So that's actually one of the really cool things that you can do out there. I like to say that you can purple team and threat model your way into active defense. And the reason why I say this is because with the threat modeling exercise, you will start to understand what are the potential risks, what are the variables that we need to understand in order to be effectively defend the environment. And with the purple teaming, you can actually go down the way of simulating some of those attacks, simulating some of those failures conditions, and then seeing whether you're actually able to detect them and how you can operate in the environment where some components might fail. right? A good example of that is a lot of the companies out there rely simply on the antivirus to protect them from malware. And that works very well, but up until the point adversary works out that they can simply just remove the antivirus, and then from there, there's nothing to protect the environment. And that's actually one of the things you'll pick up during the threat modeling exercise, that you really need to start looking into what are some failure conditions that you need to understand. And if we understand the failure conditions, then what are some of the protection mechanisms that you can deploy as part of your defense tactics. And then, of course, also what you do is not just about deploying and understanding, but also trying to then simulate some of those adversary activity to work out what are some of the triggers that you might need to have in place, or they're already in place and they are actually firing and alerting and letting you know that something is happening. That is something you can monitor for. So that will be some of the kind of key critical steps to take when we're looking to defend some of our assets, and we're looking to use some of the frameworks and the key concept we shared here.
Cool. So do we have any questions, or should we kind of move on to how you can engage? David, have we got any questions in the panel?
We are very quiet on the panel, so there's nothing coming through yet. So I must assume that Yuri and Tim are doing an incredible job so far. But if there are any questions, please do use the Q&A panel. You've also got the Q&A panel via Slido as well. So we've got a couple of methods of capturing these questions. So yeah, if you don't want to wait until the end when we open up for Q&A and you want to get them in early, please do.
Cool. Well, okay, so to kind of wrap this up so that we've got the maximum messaging out in the period of time. Cisco appreciates that not all systems are necessarily well understood. It's certainly something we're seeing with customers that we're working with today. As Yuri mentioned, prevention and only security only takes you so far. If somebody can switch off the antivirus, then the antivirus perhaps isn't going to give you the detection and response capabilities that you hoped it would. It's significant investment to implement and operate a SOC. I talked about that customer that we've been working with for 4 years. Yeah, that's 4 years of fairly heavy slog to get them from a place where they felt they had challenges to a place where they feel they're slightly more confident on how they're protecting their assets. And the threat landscape is ever changing. I mentioned MITRE ATT&CK fairly early on. Yeah, that changes on almost a quarterly basis in terms of the threat intelligence that Cisco and others feed into it. The understanding about how adversaries is moving. Yeah, there are examples of things that I'm looking at today in threat intelligence reports that aren't yet in MITRE ATT&CK, and I'm sitting there and going, well, actually, this is happening regularly enough that perhaps it ought to be. And we're having those conversations with MITRE about it. So it's never a case of you can stop still. If you stop still, you'll get overtaken. Potentially, you'll get run over. In terms of the business outcomes, when we do threat modeling, we're trying to tie it back to the stuff that matters to you as a business, the things that make your customer unique. It's one thing to understand that there are all these mythical adversarial groups with fancy names out there. It's quite another to understand exactly what that might mean for your business. Cisco is firmly of the belief that we should focus on the stuff that matters most first, and not just because a regulatory requirement says that we ought to, but actually because there is a tangible long-term benefit to the organisation of doing so. If you need support in developing your capabilities, then both Yuri and I, our respective teams, are there to help you. Presuming you're already a Cisco customer, some of you, it may be simply a case of picking up that phone to your account team and having that first conversation that says, what can Cisco do to help us in that space? I think it's worth pointing out that from our perspective, at least, I think we have a pretty credible name in the industry. The work that I'm doing with MITRE, the stuff that MITRE came to me and said, can you help with this? It wasn't simply a case of me popping into Slack and dropping stuff on them, but them actually saying, well, you know, we've seen you doing a lot of work on Linux security. How can you help us with that? Or speaking to Cisco's internal teams about routers and switches. What do you know about routers and switches, Cisco? So I think we're fairly credible in that space. There are people all over the globe. This isn't just a Yuri and Tim show. Yuri has an entire team of incident responders who are there to help from a perspective of the worst day of your lives. I'm there to try and help ensure that you don't have the worst day of your lives. and anything we can do in the meantime to, as I said, to raise the tide and lift all the ships, I think from my perspective is beneficial and something we should do as a social good, if nothing else. And with that, I think we're probably about done. So if we do have any questions, any areas where clarification is required, or just any areas where you want me to switch back to previous slides and explain them in a bit more depth, I'm happy to do so.
So thank you very much to you both for doing that and running through the details that you have. We've got one question that's come in via the Q&A panel. Mohammed's asking, at what size and scale should we start thinking about threat modelling? So where is threat modelling appropriate to what type of organisation?
So, I mean, any sized organisation, in all honesty, can benefit. I think it works better the larger the organisation you are, because that's when silos become more pronounced. I always say that the first threat model that I produce for an organisation is always going to be the first of a number. And it tends to be that enterprise level view, starting to get a feel for which moving parts, which teams matter. What you tend to find is that organisations that adopt this kind of thing wholeheartedly then go, well, actually, we need to threat model all of these individual systems, because all of these individual systems we need more detail on. Yuri and I about 3 years ago did a round of threat modelling for a financial institution, where they were literally asking us to go through all of their payment systems, because they'd reached the point where they threat modelled their organisation and had concluded that the business resiliency was, for a financial service institution, very much dependent on payment infrastructure. And we literally went through all of their different payment mechanisms. So you can kind of scale it. One of the things we've done quite consciously with threat modelling is taking the views that we won't promise that Earth, it's a fixed size service, it has a limited amount of contact with you, and whether we take a set of binoculars and try and look at the entire landscape of your organisation, or whether we take a magnifying glass and zoom in on one particular bit, that depends on your level of maturity. We didn't talk about it a huge amount, but for example, if you're familiar with something like the Tiger scheme run by the European Union Central Bank, or something like CBEST run by the Bank of England, those kinds of organisations will very much be drilling in on specific aspects they want to explore in greater detail. But you could find an organisation who's right at the beginning of the journey who just wants that first glance. And it, as I said, it could be any size. We've done it for organisations that are 20 or 30 people. We've done it for organisations that are tens of thousands of people.
And probably I'll add one comment. We've got another question I'll go to in just a second, but one comment on there is at the smaller scale, unless you're getting involved with a large SP, for example, service provider, end to end, this is, you engage us and within 4 weeks, Tim's delivering a report. So we're not talking about something that is a huge undertaking. It's a very valuable undertaking, but it can be very focused and targeted, as Tim's just said.
Bang for buck. Bang for buck is the important watchword. If we're not efficient with how we spend our investment in cybersecurity, we'll end up spending it in the wrong places. Brilliant.
A question that's come through on Slido. I don't know who's asked this, so I can't credit anyone. How does the roadmap look like? Identification of critical assets. What then? Developing security architecture, SOC practice, IR. So I can see you going back to the slide that answers this, Tim. If you just spend a bit more time talking about that, and if someone wants to come off with you, then to answer that ask that in a different way, please do. But otherwise, it's in your court, Tim.
I think that's the critical piece, right? There are organisations for whom this is a tactical endeavour. If you look at, as I said, the banks, for example, they are already doing red teaming. This is just an opportunity to hone the way that they're doing the red teaming, to think about from a different perspective what things they ought to red team. So for them, it's probably going to be quite tactical. If you think about a manufacturing organisation that's really never thought about anything other than availability as their only metric for success, who is now being told, guess what, you're affected by NIS2, you're considered critical infrastructure, we care about the quality of the pharmaceuticals or the food that you're generating. This might be an entire systemic reset, in which case, yeah, it might be an architectural conversation and dovetailing with the enterprise architects that already exist in your organization. And then that middle ground could be an organization that is doing software development or building systems of some fashion, and I actually just want to be a slightly more confident about the approaches they're taking. And we've done all three. Architects, it's probably a bigger piece of work. It's probably that first step in, yeah, an 18-month journey with normally quite a lot of investment behind it. Red teams, it could be just the first 2 or 3 days of what actually becomes a red team engagement of 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, or whatever else it happens to be. Engineers, it can actually simply be a case of having a friendly face and a friendly point of contact, so that actually over a longer period of time, when you've got interesting questions about the systems you're managing or the systems you're building, you know who to come and talk to, and you can have those conversations in a kind of a staggered fashion. But ultimately, it's about making sure that the controls are appropriate, that the risks are being considered, and that the business functions are protected. I'm proving that, because ultimately that's the piece that at the top of the tree they worry about. They don't necessarily worry so much about the how, but they certainly do worry about the fact that they're not going to get called by the press or called into the regulator's office, or worse, because the things that they thought they were doing to protect the business didn't have the value and didn't protect the business the way they'd hoped.
Excellent, thank you. So I think hopefully that's answered the question. Whoever asked that, if it hasn't, please raise your hand and we'll come to you, or type out again. But I think, yeah, as Tim's saying there, the important point here is that the threat modeling exercise really helps to inform what you should do next. There is no set pattern of what you have to do going from here. So what next? Of developing a security architecture, SOC practice, IR. Yeah, they're all great ideas, but whatever comes next has to be relevant to your organization and relevant to the risks that are being identified. It's not a one-size-fits-all playbook.
We've also done cases where actually it's just been an exercise in vetting a threat model that's already been built internally. So actually, in a case like that, we have customers we've done it once for, and then they've been happy with the results, and they've kind of gone, this tallies with what we thought, and they've just moved on at their own pace. Marking your homework is sometimes a reason for doing this also.
Yeah. One more question that's come through. We've got how this modeling concept could turn into a more discrete exercise, leveraging hyperautomation, for example. Jabor, if feel free to come off mute if you can phrase that, or you want to phrase that in a different way. But Tim, Yuri, what's your thoughts there?
Well, I guess that's the direction of travel, right? There's certainly people inside Cisco who are busy telling me that we can do all of the threat modeling in an automated fashion, and actually they probably can. The bit that's difficult is ascribing that value. You think about machine learning in a general sense, a lot of the time the data is only valuable once it's been labeled. The perfect example I can give you of where I think we've hit a sweet spot, we have a customer that is using an enterprise architecture platform, and they've got a really good understanding about their graph in a general sense. They understand who's responsible for which bits of the business. They understand which systems support which processes. They understand all of that. They haven't got any security labeling on it at all. In that instance, actually, probably what we'll do is we'll just put security labeling onto what they've already built from an enterprise architecture perspective. And then the enterprise architects can go and run those requirements in exactly the same way as they run all of their other business requirements going forwards. And there they'll be able to use all of their existing business functions, all of their existing technology stack, just with an additional piece of information which comes from a considered background of a security practitioner such as myself.
I can add something to that as well. So hyper automation typically would rely on building kind of hyperscale on the systems, right? So you're looking at spinning up a whole data center in a way. or scaling up a data center whenever there is a need for that. So like a major event, for example, we had one of those major events here in the country a couple of months ago, where we had to scale up a additional resources because the event was so big and the transmission was so large and whatnot. So with the threat modeling exercises, what you would like to do is, if you understand the attack surface, if you understand what are the defense mechanisms you need to build into the environment, if you understand some of those key processes you're trying to protect, then transcribing that into, let's say, Terraform, transcribing that into, let's say, Ansible, some of those kind of hyper automation solutions where you can spin an entire DC by writing infrastructure as a code, would be the next natural step as well. So you could venture down all the way down to, for example, doing a threat modeling exercise, designing an architecture where you know that there's a resilience built into it, that you understand what are the limitations, what are the processes you need to protect, how to scale them up whenever needed, like let's say under denial of service condition or under the increased traffic load. And then transcribing that into a formal kind of document or even a code, if you wish to do so. And transcribe that in there. So then when you press the Terraform apply command, it starts spinning up the infrastructure and securing it exactly the way you need it to be secured. Now you need to execute that threat modeling exercise first to understand those threats, understand what are the defense mechanisms you're building, understand what you're trying to protect. Is simply patching a Windows box good enough? Probably not. We might have to have an automated script that, for example, harden it, ensure that appropriate logging is being fed to a specific location. Maybe we must spin up a SOC instance that digests all the data straight up from, for example, infrastructure as a code. So that's where that kind of element would fit in. And as you replicate those systems, as you build them, as you create that hyperscale that you're looking to get there, that will then feed directly into the code or a mechanism that you use to perform that. I personally love terraforming, so I terraform everything I can, and that means that I'm able to replicate the same infrastructure over and over again with all the changes, all the security I want in it, all the monitoring, and everything else that I like to play with in the and all the hardening as I go. So every single box is hardened to the same standard. It has the same monitoring capabilities, etc. So that could be a very good concept. And I've done a bit of this myself, a bit my threat modeling on my own system, right, to understand what are the weaknesses I'm trying to protect from.
Yeah, that enterprise architecture I was talking about, all of that information is exposed out as tags. So when they spin up a new cloud infrastructure, they can pull that information in, and that defines how that infrastructure will be built. And so if they tag up an infrastructure as being managing PII, guess what? Slightly different controls maybe will get applied from if they were tagging it up as being, I don't know, a test environment, for example.
Brilliant. We've got about 60 seconds left. There's one more question. So we've had a question from me saying, can threat modeling be performed as part of a risk assessment as part of, for example, NIS2? Now, very quickly, I'll say I know the language of this presentation has been very much around the MITRE ATT&CK framework, but this process is applicable to NIS2, to NIST, to other frameworks. And Tim, perhaps you can touch on some of the other examples of where we've used something that isn't just the MITRE ATT&CK framework. It is a portable process of threat modeling. MITRE is the most common, but certainly other things are mappable into this process.
So we heavily believe in traceability. So for the most part, if you're looking at it from an architecture perspective, the traceable elements are going to be slightly different from if you're looking at it from an operational perspective. But yeah, you're right. So you can go everything from CSF through to ISO 27001 through to IEC 62443. And look at how those things together. And I was just this week I was sitting down and looking at how DORA, which is financially focused, and NIS2 play together, and what the similarities and commonalities are there, so that we can actually express the threat landscape appropriately, whether somebody wants to talk DORA, whether they want to talk NIS2. And actually a lot of the regulatory level stuff is going to remain the same. It's just about the vertical and the vertical specifics. So yes, you can use this inside of a bigger piece of work. That's what that architecture piece is all about, right? It's about transforming the business, not just the detection capabilities.